We continue in our reading through the Bible. For those of you who are with us for the first time this morning, we started in January with Genesis, and we're going to end in December with Revelation. So we've been reading through the Bible, and we've gotten to the, as a reading goes, the somewhat tricky part of Chronicles, which is a review of Samuel in so many ways, and a reminder of everything that's already happened. And so we hear these stories, and we've been reading through the Bible, we've heard them again, and the trick is sometimes to figure out what's the point in reading them twice, and then as a pastor and a preacher, what good do I have to offer in reading this as a sermon? So fortunately, I spent some time looking at this and trying to figure out what's going on. And one of the things that's being talked about here pretty clearly is that there's talk of a transition. That something new is happening with the people of Israel. Something has changed in who they are. That they no longer can operate the same way that they did for so many years. That something has to change. Now, we follow Israel's history just back to Egypt. When Moses came and brought them out of Egypt, they always had a particular kind of leader. Somebody who basically did all the work. Moses, Joshua. And then you had the king, you got Saul, you got David, they had Solomon. They always had someone who was in charge, who was listening to God for the people and telling everybody what to do. Now certainly they weren't doing all of the work, but the work that was being done by others was being divvied out as if to say, here's how you need to do it, here's how I would do it, and so this is how you will do it when you do it, so as to relieve the burden from me. So the work was always done in particular in certain ways throughout history and throughout this time of coming out of Egypt into the Promised Land. And that's a pretty good kind of leadership if you're going to be a nomadic people who live for 40 years in the desert. They have that person who can say, here's what you need to do to make it to the next step. Here's what you need to do to get to the next place. There wasn't a lot of room for discussion. There wasn't a lot of room for opinions. They had this pretty specific goal in mind. But once you get out of the desert, once you come out of exile, out of captivity, out of slavery, and you move into the Promised Land, once you get to this place of promise, the need for particular kind of labor is gone. Some skills are no longer necessary. A particular skill that was no longer necessary in the Promised Land, in Jerusalem, in Israel, was the need to take the tent down and put the tent up. Take the tent down, put the tent up. Take the tent down, put the tent up. That's a pretty important skill if you're out in the desert. Put it up and take it down a certain way. You go before, you carry the ark before, you carry the promise before, and make sure it was done in a particular way. But for years and generation, I guess, people were passing this on, and now that skill was no longer necessary. It was obsolete. So the Levites had to have something new to do at that point. They had to learn to work in a different way. To be involved in a different way. I'm thinking 40 years camping in the desert with thousands upon thousands of people is a pretty difficult task. The camping that I do amounts to 3 or 4 days at a time. I was thinking about this, Leah and I went on a camping trip years ago before we had children in Yosemite. Yosemite National Park, and we were 3.5 days out in the backcountry, which means you only see 2 or 3 people out there. So you're out in the backcountry for 2 or 3 days, and with our bear canisters, and then to carry all your trash in and carry all your trash out, and just enough food to get by. And by the end of 3.5 days, you're not looking all that nice. But you feel pretty good about yourself. That you become self-reliant and you're like, okay, I can take on anything. And so what happens is for us, if we're coming back and we're hiking down with this Bridal Veil and the falls that are right there, Vernal Falls coming down into the valley, and you start to see people that are dressed a lot like you right now. They're really kind of, they're chipper and they're bouncing around, and they have their hair perfect, and they have makeup on, and they smell good. And by this point in the 3.5 days, we don't smell that good. I'm sorry, I'm sure Leah smelled perfectly wonderful. I don't smell that good. And people are looking at us like, what's wrong with him? We're looking at them like, what's wrong with you? And I remember getting on one of those little buses that takes you from place to place in the valley, and nobody would want to sit next to us. Backpacks, and you're sitting there, and you're nasty, and it was like they're looking at us going, no, we don't want to sit next to you. We have plenty of room. That's 3.5 days. And we had thought we had to acquire some like specific skills, and we still had to find a way to integrate back into society after 3.5 days, and like use a fork and a knife for our food, and have some etiquette, and actually go and take a shower and clean up. It's a different kind of living. It's true for the people coming out of the desert. They had to learn to live in a different kind of way, to think in a different kind of way, to divide the labor in a different kind of way. I was even thinking about in the desert how the different family groups had to really care mostly about their stuff. Sure, they were worried about what God was calling them to do, but that was up to Moses and Joshua and really those smart people that were given these jobs. But the people that aren't named, they're just a bunch of numbers, they were worried about making sure their family was taken care of, and that their tent went up and down, and that their stuff was taken care of, and that they got all their people to the promised land. So a lot of people were just really worried about their own things, their own little agendas as they got there. So in Chronicles, it starts to talk to us in a very small way. This is the beginning of it. In a very small way, though, of how we can divide the labor in a different way, in a more effective and efficient way for ministry. When you start to read Chronicles in that way, you can see pretty clearly that it does talk about what goes on in churches. It talks about what goes on in the Methodist church, the big Methodist church, and it talks about what goes on even at Red Bank, in churches around the world. One of the things that people don't realize about Methodist pastors, and when they build a new building, the average stay after a new building is finished for a Methodist pastor is under 2 years. It's under 2 years. It has a lot to do because it changes the way you lead and the way you act. Because when you're building a building in a church setting, usually the pastor and one other person work really, really hard to make sure it happens and tells everybody else what to do. It's a pretty effective way of building a building, too. I'm not saying that there's a better way. And I'm guessing that's pretty close to what happened here. I wasn't here for your building. It was probably one person, and the pastor kind of push, and we all said, let's go. And then you get to the building, and things have to change. Everybody's little agendas on the side now have to come into this one place. And usually the pastor has to leave. I can remember clearly when I was sent to start a new church 15 years ago. And the best thing about starting a new church is you never have to hear these words. We've never done it that way before. And I was always there longer than everybody else had ever been. And the other good thing about it is we had absolutely no money. And you know what you can do with no money? Whatever you want. You can do whatever you want with no money. If you have nothing to lose, you can do whatever you want. People in Israel, people come out of Egypt, they could do whatever they wanted in the desert. They had nothing to lose, but now they're coming to a place where now they're going to start talking about building something. They had something to lose. I remember clearly from our 4th location as a new church pastor, walking to our permanent location across the street, leading the congregation across the street, walking. And I remember looking back on it, I didn't see it clearly then, but thinking, what am I going to do now? What am I going to do now? How am I going to lead people in a new building? Really, if I think it was right, I should have kept on walking. I should have just took them into the building and said, you're on your own, find a new preacher, because I can't do it anymore, because I don't know how to lead you in this new place. The transitions of churches have been going on for a long time. The transitions of God's people have been going on for a long time. And in the end, I believe that one of the ways churches will be judged by God is how we deal with those transitions. How we deal with those transitions, how we grow from one place to the next. How we recognize that the ministry that's happening at Red Bank now can't be done the way it was done 20 years ago. Can't be done the way it was done 10 years ago. Can't be done the way it was done 5 years ago or even 6 months ago. It has to be done in the context of right now. With the skills that are needed right now. We don't need people putting up tents and taking them down. We need people being involved in ministry in new ways. And what is transferable is not always our skills, but the passion and the love for what we have. The people of Israel had a passion to follow God across the desert into a promised land. That's a transferable thing. Passion. Our passion and our love for Jesus Christ, that's transferable. The skills we had 20 years ago may not be good for right now, but our passion is good for right now, and we can find ways to share the duties of ministry in new and wonderful ways. When I read Chronicles, I see the beginning of that for God's people. They came out of the desert, and there was no longer a need for them to set up a tent in a certain way. But they could take the passion and the love they had for serving God and use it in new and remarkable ways. And I believe that's where we are today as Red Bank United Methodist Church. We can take the passion we have for following God, the love we have for Jesus Christ, and find ways to share in the duty. Not wait for me to tell you what to do and do it my way, because that's the best way to do it. And if you do it particularly like this, everything will come together. But to do it God's way, and look for that way to discern what God is calling us to do. To not just share the duties, but to share in the ownership of all the ministry of the church. It's time for us to share the duties. It's time for us to take the next step, even beyond 2 Chronicles, and take the next step that Jesus talked about, that the church has talked about for thousands of years. And be reminded once again that we are the priesthood. I'm not the priest of believers. We are the priesthood of all believers. And we all have something to offer. The first thing we have to offer is our passion for ministry. Let's find a way to utilize that passion and to grow in our ministry, to grow in our mission, and to become the church that God has called us to. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.